The 12 colonies of Cobol had burned 4 years ago. That was the number Laura Roslin kept returning to as she stood at the viewport of Colonial 1, watching the gas giant below, a bruised violet world ringed with ice and debris, turn slowly in the dark. For years since the Silence had come in their hundreds, since the mushroom clouds had risen over Caprica and Pecan and Scorpia, since 40 billion human beings had been reduced to ash and memory in the span of 11 hours. For years of running, of rationing, of burying the dead in airlocks because there was no ground left to put them in. And now this. The system they'd jumped into looked wrong in the way that only something miraculous could look wrong, too familiar, too ordered, the star at its center burning at exactly the right frequency, the planet spaced with the quiet geometry of somewhere that could sustain life. Kara's coordinates had brought them here. Kara, who had returned from her own death with starlight in her eyes and music humming in her fingers, had punched these numbers into the NAV computer herself and told Adama, with the absolute calm of someone who had stopped being afraid of the universe, that this was the way. The way to Earth. President Roslin pressed 2 fingers to her lips and said nothing for a long moment. Colonial 1, this is Galactica Actual. Adama's voice came through the wireless, rough as gravel, steady as a bulkhead. We're reading 2 ships in high orbit over the 3rd planet. Metallic hull construction. Drive signatures unlike anything in our database. No silent configuration. A pause that carried the weight of 4 years in it. They're broadcasting on multiple frequencies. Colonial 1, you need to hear this. The signal came through a half-second later, and Laura Roslin felt the breath leave her body. It was in English. Not the clipped, formal colonial standard she'd grown up with, not the regional dialects of Geminon or Leonis, something subtly different in cadence and vowel shape, the accent of a civilization that had evolved its language in a different direction over centuries she couldn't account for. But the words were unmistakable. A standard hailing protocol. An identification. A planet name, Shanxi. And beneath the static and the distance, the fundamental architecture of a human voice saying we see you, identify yourself, we mean no harm. Mr. Gaeta, she said, and her voice was almost steady. Get me Admiral Adama. 12 hours earlier, the people of Shanxi colony had been arguing about water reclamation subsidies. It was, Lieutenant Caden Alenko would later reflect in his report, the most ordinary morning the colony had ever had, and the last one it would have for quite some time. The colony was young, barely 5 years established, 40,000 people scratching agriculture out of soil that the terraforming teams were still convincing to cooperate. The kind of posting that career alliance officers avoided if they could manage it. General Williams had taken the assignment without complaint, which was either a measure of his discipline or his resignation, depending on who you asked. Then the mass relay in the outer system had lit up. Not with the contained, directed transit energy of a proper relay jump. With something Messier, something that the relay's passive sensors flagged as an interaction rather than an activation, as if the relay had reached out to a passing ship and the ship had passed through it sideways, like light bending through improperly cut glass. The energy signature was enormous. And it wasn't one ship. It was 147. General Williams was still pulling on his uniform when the sensor officer gave him the preliminary count. 147 vessels of wildly inconsistent size and configuration, freighters, tankers, what looked like a cruise liner with hull plating welded over its observation decks, and in the center of the formation, something that made the general's senior tactical officer go very quiet for a moment before she said, carefully, "Sir, that's a warship. Old design, big, heavily armed, and it is radiating combat readiness." The general had looked at the sensor return for 4 seconds. Then he'd ordered the colony's 2 alliance frigates, Canny and Thermopylae, to intercept at safe distance, weapons cold, and begun composing the most important first contact report in human history. He hadn't expected, when the response came back, to hear English. The first face-to-face communication between the 2 human civilizations took place over a video link so degraded by the incompatibility of their respective communication protocols that both sides were working from images that looked like they'd been rendered in watercolor. Admiral William Adama sat in his command chair aboard Galactica, still in his duty blues, and looked at the pixelated face of General Williams across 40,000 kilometers of space, and neither man said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. "Admiral Adama," Williams said finally. "Systems Alliance Navy." "Admiral Adama," Adama replied. "Colonial Fleet." He let that sit for a second, then added, in the tone of a man who had stopped being surprised by the impossible around the time a dead pilot returned from the nebula with a gift from God, "Your world. We didn't know anyone was here." "Our colony," Williams said carefully. "Shanxi. Third planet, this system." He paused. "You said Colonial Fleet. Which colony?" Adama looked at him with eyes that had watched 40 billion people die. "All of them," he said. "We're what's left." The silence that followed that statement was the kind that changes rooms permanently. General Williams sat with it for a moment, and then something shifted in his face, not pity exactly, something older and more serious than pity. He was a military man. He understood what "what's left" meant in the language of survival. "How many people?" he asked. 49,812, Adama said, with the precision of a man who checked that number every morning. "We've been running for 4 years. We need fuel, food, water, and medical supplies. We have nothing to offer you except the fact that we mean no harm." He paused. "And we'd prefer to establish that quickly, because we have enemies that follow us, and I'd rather your people know the difference before they arrive." On Shanxi's surface, Laura Roslin was already being shuttled down. And in the outer system, the passive sensors aboard Galactica. Sensors tuned by 4 years of running from things that wanted them dead, had just detected a new set of drive signatures dropping out of FTL at the system's edge. Not Cylon. Something else entirely. Something that had no record in any colonial database, moving in formation with the discipline of a military that had never had to learn the hard way that war was coming, because war had always been the world they were born into. Kara Thrace was in the Combat Information Center when the contact resolved Andrades, and she looked at it with the expression of someone who had faced down a Cylon-based star alone and found the experience instructive. "Admiral," she said, "we've got company. And they're not ours. If you want to see more characters enter the Mass Effect galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The galaxy remembers." Adama's standing order, established somewhere in the brutal tutorial of the first year of running, was that unknown contacts got eyes before they got weapons. Starbuck had argued with this policy exactly once, over COBOL, and the Admiral had explained his position with the particular clarity he reserved for conversations he didn't intend to have twice. So the Raptors went out. 2 of them, ECM suites hot, transponders dark, Lieutenants Agathon and Figursky threading through the debris field on the system's ecliptic plane with the patient, unhurried professionalism of people who had been doing dangerous things quietly for a very long time. What they saw made Agathon reach for the wireless 3 times before he found the words. The ships were unlike anything in colonial recognition databases. Sleek where colonial vessels were functional, aggressive in their geometry in a way that suggested a species that had developed its aesthetic of war separately from its aesthetic of everything else. 3 vessels in a patrol formation, moving with the coordination of a military culture that took formation discipline seriously, which, in Agathon's experience, was either very reassuring or very dangerous, depending entirely on whether they decided you were a threat. "Galactica, Raptor 1, he said. "Contacts are military. 3 vessels. Drive signatures are. I don't know what those drive signatures are. Not Cylon. Not anything." He watched his instruments. "They're accelerating toward Shanxi. Not toward us. Toward the planet." Aboard Galactica, Adama absorbed this with the stillness of a man who had learned that panic was a resource you couldn't afford to waste. "Get me General Williams," he said. The transmission reached Shanxi's orbital command post 40 seconds later, and General Williams listened to Adama's description of the incoming contacts with the expression of a man watching a weather system develop faster than the forecast had promised. He'd already seen them on his own sensors. The Alliance's detection equipment was considerably more sophisticated than anything the Colonials were running, and his tactical officer had been tracking the Turian patrol for 11 minutes. "We know," Williams said. "They're responding to the relay activation. Standard protocol, a patrol investigates any unauthorized relay use." He hesitated, choosing his next words with the care of someone who understood that the person on the other end of the line was operating without context. "Admiral, there are rules about mass relay activation. The relay in your system's outer edge, the object that your fleet apparently passed through to get here, it's ancient technology. Prothean built. Whoever controls access to it controls a great deal." Adama's expression on the screen didn't change perceptibly, but Williams had been reading soldiers long enough to catch the micro-adjustment around the eyes that meant "I have no idea what you just said, but I'm filing it for later." "These incoming ships," Adama said. "Are they yours?" "No," Williams said carefully. "They're Turian. A species, an alien species, that patrols this region of space. They'll want to know who activated the relay." He paused again. "Admiral, I need to stress something. This contact needs to be handled very carefully. First contact protocols exist for a reason. The wrong signal, the wrong posture, could—" "I understand," Adama said, and the two words carried the weight of a man who had made first contact with the end of his civilization and survived it. "How long do we have?" Williams checked his display. "At current acceleration, they'll be in communication range in approximately 4 hours. Weapons range in 6. 4 hours. Adama stood up from his command chair, a gesture that, on Galactica's CIC, meant the conversation had moved from assessment to decision, and turned to Starbuck, who was watching the Draughty's display with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the particular configuration that meant she was running tactical scenarios in her head and not liking most of them. "How are we for fuel?" he asked Colonel Tai. Tai's expression answered before his mouth did. "4% Tilium reserves across the fleet. We could make maybe 2 jumps. 3 if we're lucky and we don't care about precision. Medical?" Doc Cottle is stretched. "We've got 3 ships showing outbreak-level respiratory infections. Nothing lethal yet, but—" "Vipers?" 41 combat-ready. Another 12 in various states of repair that Tyrol thinks he can have operational in. "How long?" 12 hours if he doesn't sleep." Adama nodded slowly. The mathematics of their situation were not new to him. They were, in fact, the same mathematics he'd been running for 4 years, just with different variables plugged in. The equation always came out the same way: they had less than they needed and more than nothing, and the margin between those two things was where the Colonial Fleet lived. He turned back to the screen. "General," he said, "I need to be honest with you about something." Williams waited. "My people are exhausted. We have 49,000 civilians on ships that were never designed for the journey they've made. We have a military force that is highly experienced and extremely motivated, but we are not in a position to project strength we don't have." He said it the way he said most important things, plainly, without apology, making eye contact with the camera as if he could look Williams directly in the face. "We need sanctuary. We need it now, and we need it to hold. Whatever conversation you need to have with these Turian ships, I would strongly prefer to have it as something other than an unknown variable floating in the middle of your system." Williams was quiet for a moment. Around him, his staff were performing the careful, controlled chaos of a command post shifting to elevated readiness, extra personnel at sensor stations, the frigates Canny and Thermopylae repositioning, Shanxi's ground garrison being briefed. "I can offer you orbital positioning near Shanxi," he said finally. "Keep your fleet close to the planet, inside our sensor envelope. Don't power up weapons unless fired upon." He met Adama's gaze through the pixelated connection. And Admiral, when the Turians make contact, let me do the talking. They know us. They don't know you, and until they do, you are the most dangerous unknown in this system. Adama almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it got close. That, he said, is a feeling I'm very familiar with. On the surface of Shanxi, Laura Roslin was sitting across a folding table from a colonial administrator named Devereaux, drinking something hot that was almost but not quite coffee, and having the conversation she'd been waiting 4 years to have. Not the political conversation, that would come. Devereaux was already on his communicator with Alliance brass on Earth, and Roslin could hear the controlled alarm in the voices coming back. Humanity had found other humans, impossible humans, humans who claimed to come from 12 worlds that didn't appear on any star chart and who had arrived through a mass relay in a fleet of ships that didn't match any known configuration, and Earth's government was doing what governments always did with information that didn't fit their frameworks, escalating frantically upward until it reached someone with the authority to be appropriately overwhelmed by it. No, not the political conversation. The human one. How many children? Roslin asked. Devereaux, who had not expected this question, blinked. On Shanxi? About 8,000. It's a young colony, lots of. In the fleet, Roslin said. We have 4,211 children under the age of 12. She looked out the window at the Shanxi sky, real sky, atmosphere sky, the kind that went on forever and smelled like dirt and growing things and the particular mineral sharpness of a world that was still becoming itself. The oldest ones don't really remember the colonies. They were born on ships, or they were very young when, she stopped. It's important to me that you know that. That there are children. That we are a civilization, not just a military force that appeared in your system. Devereaux looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. We'll feed them first, he said quietly. Roslin's composure, which had survived 4 years of apocalypse, came very close to failing over a plate of actual vegetables and a man who understood without being told what feeding children first meant. She steadied herself, because there was no time yet for that. Because somewhere above them, on Galactica's Draughties, the Turian patrol was still accelerating, and 4 hours was already becoming 3. The Turian patrol group dropped out of FTL at the system's edge with the precise, unhurried confidence of a military that had been enforcing relay protocols for 300 years. There were 5 ships, 2 frigates, a cruiser, and a pair of fast attack craft that Williams's tactical officer identified as Turian Hierarchy-class interceptors, the kind of vessel designed to run down fleeing targets and make the running stop. They decelerated in formation with the choreographed discipline of a species that treated military doctrine the way other cultures treated religion, and their lead vessel, the cruiser Unbroken Resolve, under General de Solas Arterius, broadcast a standard relay violation challenge on all known frequencies. Standard, in this context, meant the Citadel's 17 recognized contact languages. It did not mean English. It did not mean Colonial Standard. Williams was already transmitting a response, Alliance diplomatic protocols, the carefully worded acknowledgement of relay activation coupled with the explanation of extraordinary circumstances that the Alliance's first contact legal team had drafted approximately 40 minutes ago in a state of what could charitably be described as controlled hysteria. When Specialist Presley's voice cut through the CIC chatter aboard Galactica with the particular tone that meant something had changed faster than the plan accounted for. Draughties contact. Fast movers. Coming from the Colonial Fleet's port side, low on the ecliptic. A pause. Admiral, they're Vipers. Not Adama's Vipers. Vipers from the Pegasus contingent. The ones that had transferred to Galactica after the Pegasus went down over New Caprica, piloted by the pilots who had served under Admiral Kane and absorbed her particular philosophy about what you did when you saw something that might be a threat. The flight leader was a Lieutenant Soren Vale, 26 years old, 11 confirmed silent kills, and he had been watching the Turian patrol decelerate for 40 minutes with increasing unease and no one explicitly telling him to stand down. No one had told him to stand down because the communication protocols between Galactica and the scattered fleet elements were still being rerouted through a makeshift relay that Gaeta had kludged together from Alliance-compatible hardware that Shanxi's technical team had jury-rigged to colonial frequencies in the past 2 hours. There was a 17-second communication lag. In combat time, 17 seconds was a geological epoch. In 17 seconds, Lieutenant Vale saw the Turian frigates rotate their weapon hardpoints toward the Colonial Fleet's civilian ships, a standard tactical assessment maneuver, the Turian equivalent of sizing up a room, and made a decision that would reshape galactic history. He opened fire. The first shots were Viper autocannon rounds, kinetic projectiles traveling at a fraction of the velocity of a mass accelerator but carrying enough mass to register as weapons fire on Turian sensor arrays regardless. They impacted the kinetic barriers of the lead Turian frigate and scattered, doing no meaningful damage, but the Turian combat AI flagged them as a hostile engagement within 0.3 seconds, and the unbroken resolve responded the way 3 centuries of military doctrine said to respond. It returned fire. A Turian frigate's main gun put a 20mm mass accelerator round through the wing of Vale's Viper at roughly 2 km per second. The wing separated cleanly. The cockpit, by a margin of engineering tolerance that Vale would later describe to Starbuck as not enough, survived. His Viper tumbled, emergency beacon screaming, and the other 5 Vipers of his flight scattered on instinct in 6 different directions, which the Turian tactical computer interpreted as an attack spread, which caused the second Turian frigate to open up, which caused Galactica's automated defense systems to register incoming fire and begin the warm-up sequence for the ship's primary batteries. In Galactica's CIC, Adama took 3 steps to the wireless console in the time it took most people to process that something had gone wrong. All Viper wings, weapons safe, break off and return to the barn. His voice was a controlled blast of authority that hit every frequency simultaneously. This is the Admiral, all colonial military units stand down immediately. Acknowledge. He turned to Tai. Get me General Williams. Already on, Tai said. Williams's face on the screen was tight. What just happened? Miscommunication, Adama said. My pilot saw the Turian ships rotate their weapons and interpreted it as threat posture. They acted without orders. He paused for exactly 1 second. I'm standing them down. Can you stop the Turian response? I'm trying, Williams said grimly. They're not receiving my transmissions yet, there's a lag in the translation matrix. Admiral, if your ships fire again. They won't, Adama said. And then, with the quiet certainty of a man who had maintained discipline over a terrified fleet for 4 years, General. My people have been running from machines that want to kill them since before your colony was established. When they see weapons turned towards civilian ships, they respond. That is not recklessness. That is survival. A beat. But I have them. They will hold. Williams held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and turned back to his own comm array. It took 11 minutes to establish a ceasefire that everyone agreed to and 4 more minutes for the Turian tactical computer to stand down its targeting solutions. In that window, 3 more Viper autocannon bursts had been exchanged with Turian point defense fire. 1 colonial fuel tanker had taken a grazing hit from a Turian interceptor that had punched through a cargo section and vented 17,000 liters of processed Tilium into space, and Starbuck had physically restrained a pilot named Hot Dog from launching without authorization by the time-honored colonial method of standing in front of his Viper with her arms out. The Tilium loss reduced their jump reserves from 4% to 2.3%. Adama stood in CIC with his hands clasped behind his back and did the math that he always did, the same math, the same variables, just slightly worse than before, and said nothing about it, because saying it wouldn't help. What helped was Gaeta, working with 3 of Shanxi's comm technicians in a relay room that smelled of solder and recycled air, finally establishing a working translation bridge between Alliance diplomatic frequencies and the Turian standard communication protocol. It was imperfect, the Turian language relied on subsonic harmonic layers that the Colonial Alliance hybrid system flattened into static, but it was enough. General de Solas Arterius's face appeared on the Unbroken Resolve's main view screen, and across the translation bridge, his voice came through clipped and precise and carrying the particular quality of controlled anger that senior Turian officers cultivated the way other species cultivated patience. General Williams. He did not say hello. Turian military protocols didn't really have a hello. You will explain the unauthorized relay activation. You will explain the identity of the unregistered fleet in your system. And you will explain why we were fired upon. Williams began explaining. De Solas listened with the stillness of a species that processed information before responding to it, his mandibles held flat against his face. A posture that Turian cultural specialists would later describe as controlled displeasure and that a colonial pilot watching the feed on Galactica described, more accurately, as the look a man gets right before he decides he's done talking. These ships, de Solas said, when Williams had finished. These humans. They are not from your civilization. No, Williams said carefully. They are a separate human population. They arrived through the relay from. They activated the relay, de Solas said. Not a question. Their arrival interacted with the relay, yes. They didn't. Under Citadel law, de Solas said, and his voice had taken on the quality of a man reciting something he had memorized because the law was the law and the law did not bend for context. Unauthorized relay activation is a violation of the Relay 314 Accord, which your species signed 6 years ago. The vessels responsible are subject to impoundment. The crew are subject to detention pending council review. He paused. This is not a negotiation, General. This is a protocol. On Galactica, Adama had been listening to the translated feed. He pressed the transmit key. General Arterius, he said, in the steady voice of a man who had once told a silent god to go to hell and walked away from the conversation. My name is Admiral William Adama. I command the Colonial Fleet. We did not activate your relay intentionally, we don't have the technology to do so. We passed through it because we had nowhere else to go. He looked directly at the camera. I understand you have laws. I understand we appear to have broken one. I am asking you, as one military officer to another, to hear the full situation before you act on protocol. Because the situation is not simple. De Solas was quiet for 4 seconds. You have 10 minutes, Admiral, he said. Make it simple. In the fuel tanker that had taken the grazing hit, a damage control team was sealing the breach with emergency foam and trying not to think about what 2.3% Tilium reserves meant for 49,000 people. Outside the viewport, Shanxi turned below them, green and gold and impossibly real, and none of them looked away from it. Adama had given the 10-minute speech before. Not this speech, not these words, not to a species with metallic skin and facial features that the translation camera rendered an unsettling half-focus, but the shape of it was familiar. The shape of it was, we are not what you think we are something worse and something better, and you need to understand the difference before you make a decision you can't take back. He had given versions of it to quorum delegates who wanted to vote him out of command. To silent representatives across a negotiating table that felt like standing on a fault line. To his own people, on the day he'd told them Earth might not exist, and watched their faces do what faces do when the last thing holding them together turns out to be a story. He gave it now to de Solas Arterius, and he gave it straight. 12 colonies. 40 billion people. Silent war. The first one, the creation of synthetic soldiers to fight humanity's conflicts, the armistice, the 40 years of silence. Then the return. 11 hours. The count, 49,812 survivors. For years of FTL jumps through uncharted space, following signals and scripture and the navigational gift of a woman who had died and come back with starlight where her certainty used to be. The relay, whatever a relay was, Adama still wasn't entirely sure. Had not been activated deliberately. Galactica's jump drive had intersected with it in a way that their engineers didn't fully understand and couldn't replicate, and they had arrived here because here was where the math had put them. He did not editorialize. He did not ask for sympathy. He presented it as a military report, because de Solis Arterius was a soldier and soldiers received reports better than they received appeals. When he finished, there was silence on the channel for long enough that Gaeta checked the transmission link twice. Then de Solis said, "Your enemies. These Cylons. They followed you." "They always have," Adama said. "Are they in this system?" "Not yet. We have reason to believe they're tracking our FTL signatures. How long we have before they arrive?" He glanced at Starbuck, who held up 3 fingers, then wobbled her hand. "Days. Possibly less." Another silence. "Shorter this time." "Admiral," de Solis said, and something in his tone had shifted. Not warmth, Turian commanders didn't do warmth, but the specific recalibration of a tactician who had received new information and was integrating it in real time. "You said your enemies are synthetic. Fully artificial intelligence, controlling autonomous military units." "Yes." "How many vessels?" At last contact, the Cylon fleet numbered over 1,000 base stars. Each base star carries approximately 400 raiders, their equivalent of a fighter craft. And several hundred Centurions for boarding operations. He paused. They also field humanoid models. Biological in appearance, synthetic in construction. Indistinguishable from humans without a specific medical scan. The silence that followed this last piece of information had a different texture than the ones before it. General Williams had been listening to the translated feed from his command post on Shanxi, and he had been doing what commanders do when information arrives faster than doctrine can process it. He had been very still and very quiet and thinking hard. When Adama finished the Cylon inventory, Williams unmuted his own channel. "General Arterius," he said carefully, "I think we need to consider that the situation has moved beyond relay protocol." De Solis's response was delayed by translation lag. When it came, it was measured in the way that Turian speech was always measured, not because Turians were slow, but because they spoke as if every sentence had already been checked against 3 contingencies. "Agreed. I am transmitting a full report to the hierarchy and requesting instruction. In the interim, the briefest pause. Admiral Adama. Your fleet will maintain current position. You will not make FTL jumps without notifying this command. In exchange, you will not be boarded or detained pending hierarchy response." It was not generosity. It was tactics. A synthetic enemy of unknown capability entering the system was a problem de Solis needed to understand before he started managing the humans who'd brought it. But it was also, in the particular grammar of military pragmatism, a beginning. "Understood," Adama said. "One condition." De Solis waited. "My people need food and medical supplies. I have civilians who haven't had a full meal in 6 days and children showing malnutrition markers." He said it without inflection, the way you stated load-bearing facts. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm telling you that 49,000 people in deteriorating condition are a security problem for everyone in this system, and the fastest way to make them not your problem is to let Shanxi help us stabilize." Williams, on his own channel, said quietly, "I've already authorized it, Admiral." Adama looked at the camera for a moment, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite gratitude, something older than both of those things. "Thank you, General," he said. The logistics of feeding 49,000 people from a colony of 40,000 was, as Shanxi's supply administrator put it with magnificent understatement, a challenge. What it actually was, in practice, was every food storage facility on the planet open and inventoried within 2 hours, every shuttle and Raptor and Alliance cargo transport running continuous surface-to-orbit runs, and the colony's medical staff triaging incoming patients with the focused efficiency of people who understood that they were being asked to do something extraordinary and had decided to simply do it. Laura Roslin worked alongside Administrator Devereaux for 6 hours straight, coordinating intake manifests and medical priority lists with the systematic focus of a woman who had run a government from a dying body and knew how to make order out of chaos. She had a gift for making bureaucracy feel like humanity, for looking at a spreadsheet full of numbers and seeing the people inside them clearly enough that the people around her saw them too. By the 4th hour, Shanxi's people were working alongside colonial civilians without being asked to, showing them how to use the colony's food processors, walking elderly survivors through the medical scanning bays, organizing play areas for children who had spent their entire remembered lives in ship corridors and were now, for the first time, standing on actual ground under actual sky and didn't quite know what to do with the vastness of it. A girl named Hera Agathon, 8 years old, half Cylon by genetics and entirely human by every measure that mattered, sat in the grass outside Shanxi's main settlement and pressed both palms flat against the ground and stayed that way for a long time with her eyes closed. Nobody interrupted her. Aboard Galactica, the uneasy ceasefire was holding, but Sol Tai had the particular expression he got when something was bothering him that he hadn't found the right words for yet, which meant it was bothering him significantly. "They're going to want to study us," he said to Adama, in the Admiral's quarters, over 2 glasses of something that was technically bourbon only because Tai had decided to call it that. "Yes," Adama said. "The ships. The jump drives. The Cylons." Tai turned his glass. "We're the most interesting thing that's happened to these people in however long they've been out here doing whatever they do. That Turian commander isn't just waiting for orders. He's gathering intelligence. I know. And the Alliance. Williams seems decent enough, but decent people answer to governments, and governments. I know, Sol." Tai was quiet for a moment. "What do we do if they decide we're more valuable as a resource than as people?" Adama looked at the photograph on his desk, his son's, young, from before. He looked at it the way he always looked at it, which was as if it were a compass rather than a memory. "The same thing we always do," he said. "We make them understand that we're not something they can afford to misuse." He set down his glass. "Get me a full readiness report on the Viper wings. And quietly, I want Tyrole's assessment of the jump drives. How many jumps we have left, best case." Tai nodded and stood. "And Sol," Adama said. "The pilots who fired without orders." Tai stopped. "Ground them," Adama said. "All of them. Vale especially. I understand why he did it. I understand it completely." His voice was level. "Ground them anyway." Tai left. Adama sat alone with the photograph and the sound of Galactica breathing around him, the deep, structural groan of an old ship that had been asked to do too much for too long and had done it anyway, and outside, through the hull, the stars of a system that was not home but might be the closest thing to it they were going to find. Then Gaeta's voice came over the ship wide, "Admiral to CIC. Drotty's contact. Long range. Sir, it's not Turian." Adama was already moving. The contact resolved on Drotty's over the course of 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes of everyone in Galactica's CIC performing the careful, practiced ritual of not saying what they were thinking until the sensor picture was clear enough to make saying it necessary. Starbuck said it first. "Base star." One word. The CIC absorbed it the way a ship absorbs a wave. A collective shift in weight, a tightening of posture, hands moving to stations with the automatic precision of people who had run this drill so many times that fear had been compressed into muscle memory. Gaeta's fingers were already on the Drotty's calibration controls, sharpening the return, pulling detail out of the signal. "Single contact," he said. "Long range, outer system. Drive signature matches Cylon base star configuration, it's running a search pattern." He looked up. "They haven't located us yet. They're sweeping." One base star was not the Cylon fleet. One base star was a scouting element, the advance finger of something larger, sent ahead to find the FTL trail and confirm before the full force committed to pursuit. Adama had seen this pattern before, over and over, in the long exhausting chase across the galaxy's dark spaces. The base star would sweep, would find the thermal residue of Galactica's jump, would transmit the coordinates, and then whatever was behind it would come. The question was always how far behind. Time to detection? Adama asked. At current sweep rate, Gata calculated. 40 minutes. Maybe 50 if we get lucky with the debris field masking our thermal signature. 40 minutes. Adama turned to the communications console. Get me General Williams and General Arterius. Both of them. Now. The three-way communication that followed was, in the judgment of everyone who participated in it, one of the stranger conversations in the history of military coordination. Two human generals and a Turian commander, connected across incompatible communication systems through a translation bridge held together with Alliance hardware and colonial ingenuity, discussing how to respond to an artificial intelligence fleet that neither the Alliance nor the Turians had known existed 60 hours ago. De Sola's Arterius processed Adama's report on the base star contact with the speed of a military mind that had been trained to triage information under pressure. His mandibles moved in a pattern that the translation system couldn't interpret and that Adama had already learned to read as the Turian equivalent of a soldier doing fast math in their head. One vessel, De Sola said. Scouting configuration, you said. Yes. Once it confirms our position, it transmits. What follows it will be significantly larger. How significantly? Adama glanced at Starbuck. She held up both hands, then did it again. Based on previous pursuit patterns, Adama said, we would expect between 8 and 20 base stars in the follow-on force. Each carries approximately 400 raiders. Additionally, he paused, because this was the part that changed rooms, the part that had changed every room he'd ever set it in. They will attempt to infiltrate your computer networks. The humanoid Cylon models can access any networked system. If your ships use networked combat AI, shared tactical databases, any integrated electronic warfare system, they will attempt to subvert it. Williams was very still on his channel. Our ships run networked combat systems, he said quietly. Standard Alliance architecture. Then you need to isolate them, Adama said. Physically. Pull the connections. Go to manual fire control if you can. He heard how it sounded. He heard the absurdity of telling a technologically advanced civilization to take their computers apart because of a threat they hadn't known existed yesterday. He said it anyway. I know that degrades your capability significantly. It also keeps your ships yours. Galactica runs isolated systems. De Solas asked. We learned to, Tai said from across the CIC, and his voice carried the specific weight of someone who had learned the hard way, which was the only way the Colonial Fleet had ever learned anything. Williams got off the channel and turned to his tactical officer with the expression of a man making a decision he knew was going to be argued with by everyone above him in the chain of command. Start pulling network connections from the frigate's combat systems, he said. Manual fire control protocols. Sir, that's going to take our targeting efficiency down by. I know what it's going to do, Williams said. Do it anyway. His tactical officer did it anyway. Williams then composed the fastest message of his career to Alliance Command on Earth, marked it Flash Urgent, and sent it through the QEC. The quantum entanglement communicator that provided instantaneous transmission across interstellar distances, one of the technologies that still struck him as mildly miraculous regardless of how routine it had become. The message was 3 paragraphs long and contained, in order, the arrival of the Colonial Fleet, the Turian patrol response, the ceasefire, the silent contact, and a request for immediate reinforcement and guidance. The response came back in 11 minutes. It was 4 words long. Hold position. Help coming. Williams looked at it for a moment, then looked at his sensor display, where the silent base star was still sweeping the outer system with 32 minutes remaining on Gata's estimate. Helpful, he said, to no one in particular. The plan that emerged from the 3-way channel was built from the pieces available, which was what plans always were when time was the constraint. De Solas would reposition his patrol group, the 2 frigates and the cruiser Unbroken Resolve. To a high-system intercept position, above the ecliptic, where Turian mass accelerator weapons had the longest effective engagement range. His fast attack interceptors would hold close to the base star's expected detection threshold, ready to harass and disrupt raider launch operations. Williams's 2 frigates, Canny and Thermopylae, would form a defensive screen around Shanxi itself, covering the civilian evacuation. Because Williams had, without being asked, begun moving Shanxi's civilian population to the colony's underground shelters the moment Adama had said scouting configuration. And Galactica. Adama had 41 combat-ready Vipers, a depleted but functional point defense battery, and 2.3% Tilium reserves. What he also had was 18 years of fighting silence. "We don't engage the base star directly," he told his wing commanders, assembled in Galactica's briefing room. Actual humans and the 2 silent members of his crew who everyone had learned to trust in the way you learn to trust something that has saved your life enough times. "We use it. A base star's primary tactical liability is its raiders. It deploys them in overwhelming numbers and relies on saturation. Our job is to channel that saturation. Keep the raiders engaged with our Vipers in the debris field where their numerical advantage compresses, give the Turian guns clean firing solutions on the base star hull, and keep their Centurion boarding parties off the civilian ships." Hot Dog, still technically grounded but present because Adama had looked the other way, raised his hand. "And if more than one base star comes through?" Adama looked at him steadily. "Then we do the same thing, and it gets harder." It was not a comforting answer. It was the only honest one. 26 minutes later, the silent base star's sweep pattern brought it across the thermal residue of Galactica's last jump, and its navigation computer flagged the match, and its communication array began transmitting on silent frequencies toward the dark space behind it. Gaeta watched the transmission spike on his board and said, quietly, "They found us." Adama nodded. He'd known this moment was coming since Caprica burned. Since before that, maybe. Since the first silent war, since the moment humanity had looked at the things it had built and failed to ask the right questions about what happened when the things you built decided they had questions of their own. "Launch alert Vipers," he said. "All hands to battle stations." Galactica's klaxon rolled through the ship like a tide, and 49,000 people spread across a fleet of exhausted ships felt it in their bones and knew what it meant, because they had always known what it meant, because it was the sound that had defined their lives for 4 years and showed no signs of stopping. On Shanxi's surface, Hera Agathon was pulled away from her patch of grass by her mother and carried underground, and she looked up at the sky as she went. At the real sky, the atmosphere sky, with the expression of a child who had just found something precious and was being asked to put it down before she'd had enough time with it. Above her, in the dark, the base star turned toward the system's heart. Behind it, in the deeper dark, 3 more drive signatures had just lit up on Galactica's long-range draughties. 3 base stars. Not 20. Not 8. 3. Which was either very good news or the leading edge of something that hadn't fully arrived yet, and Adama had been doing this long enough to know which of those options history tended to prefer. "Starbuck," he said. "Already in my bird," she said, over the wireless, from the hangar bay. "Don't get killed." "Working on it," she said, and he could hear in her voice the thing that had always been there, the reckless, burning aliveness of someone who had already died once and found the experience clarifying. The first raiders launched from the base star's launch bays like a dark tide, and the Battle of Shanxi began for the second time in history, rewritten from its first draft into something that no one in the Citadel's 50,000-year archive of galactic events had any framework to describe. The raiders came in fast and they came in coordinated, which was the thing that people who hadn't fought Cylons never quite understood until they were inside it. It wasn't the numbers, though the numbers were bad, 3 base stars putting out roughly 1,200 raiders in the first wave, a figure that made Gaeta's voice go tight when he read it off the draughties. It was the coordination. Cylon raiders didn't communicate through radio. They didn't use tactical networks that could be jammed or command structures that could be decapitated. They thought together, the way a single organism thinks. The turn of one raider telegraphed through the entire formation instantaneously, adjustments propagating at the speed of a shared nervous system, making them respond to tactical changes not sequentially but simultaneously. Human fighter pilots compensated for this with experience, aggression, and the particular cognitive flexibility that came from being mortal and knowing it. Starbuck led her wing into the debris field on the system's ecliptic plane and compressed the engagement the way Adama had briefed, forcing the raider swarm to chase her into the narrow corridors between tumbling rocks and ice fragments where their numerical advantage became a liability, where the sheer density of the formation worked against the coordination that made it lethal. She flew with the specific quality of controlled fury that had characterized her since the academy. Not reckless, never actually reckless, but operating at the exact margin where most people's hands started shaking and hers got steadier. "Tight on me," she told her wing. "Don't give them room to spread. Make them come through the rocks." Behind her, 11 Vipers threaded into the debris field like needles, and the first raider formation followed, and the killing started. The Turian frigates fired first at range. The Solas had positioned the Unbroken Resolve and her escorts at the optimal elevation above the ecliptic, a firing position that Turian tactical doctrine called the high anchor, which gave mass accelerator weapons the longest possible engagement window against targets moving in the system plane below. The physics of mass accelerator fire favored this geometry. Rounds traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light needed the longest possible flight path to be steered by the target's own predictable momentum, and from the high anchor, the Turian gunners could engage base stars at ranges that the Cylon vessels hadn't encountered before. The first mass accelerator salvo from the Unbroken Resolve impacted the lead base star's hull and did something that Adama, watching on Galactica's sensor feed, found briefly fascinating and then set aside to deal with later. It hurt it. Not catastrophically, the base star's hull was dense and the Cylon repair systems were fast, but it hurt it, in a way that conventional colonial weaponry at long range generally couldn't manage. Mass accelerator rounds carried kinetic energy that scaled with velocity in ways that made them disproportionately effective against large, slow-turning targets. The base stars began maneuvering to reduce their profile, which was exactly what Adama had hoped for, because a base star focused on evading Turian fire at long range was a base star that was temporarily not focused on the civilian fleet. "Canny, Thermopylae," Williams's voice came over the combined tactical channel that Gaeta had somehow knitted together from 3 incompatible communication architectures. "Defensive positions. Nothing gets through to the civilian ships. Nothing." "Copy that," Shanxi commanded. Canny's captain, a woman named Cho, had the particular tone of someone who had trained for combat her entire career and was now discovering that training was a map and the territory was considerably more textured. "We're reading raider elements breaking off from the main engagement. They're going for the civilian fleet's flank. Galactica's point defense handles the flank," Adama said. "Get your frigates between the base stars and the planet." Galactica's point defense batteries were 40 years old and had been repaired so many times that Chief Tyrell had once described their maintenance history as a philosophical document about the nature of persistence. They were also, because 40 years of continuous operation in a war that never fully ended had a way of concentrating wisdom, manned by gunners who could thread a firing solution through a debris field in conditions that would have washed out most Academy graduates. The raider elements coming for the civilian fleet's flank hit Galactica's point defense envelope and found it considerably more coherent than their tactical projections had suggested, which was the silent equivalent of surprise, not an emotional state but a computational one, a flag in the shared consciousness that said recalculate. They recalculated. They adapted. They sent more raiders. Galactica took 3 direct hits in 4 minutes. 2 glancing strikes on the port flight pod that buckled a section of landing deck and started a fire that damage control had contained in 90 seconds, and 1 solid hit amidships that punched through an outer hull section and killed 2 crew members in the decompression before the emergency bulkhead sealed. Adama heard the casualty report and filed it in the same place he filed all casualty reports. Not away, never away, but aside, in a space where it would be carried rather than processed until after, because during was not the time for processing. Hull breach on frame 47, Tai reported. Contained. We've lost 2-point defense batteries on the port quarter. Reroute coverage from the starboard batteries. That opens a gap on. I know. Fill it with Vipers. He paused. Get Tyrol moving on those 12 reserve birds. In the three-way tactical channel, something unexpected was happening. De Solis Arterius was asking questions. Not the questions of a commander seeking clarification, the questions of a military analyst building a model, rapid and precise, the kind of interrogation that happened when a Turian officer recognized that they were encountering something genuinely new and needed to understand it before the engagement ended and the lesson became unavailable. Admiral Adama. The Cylon vessels. They're adapting to our firing patterns. Yes, Adama said, watching his own draughties. They always do. They share tactical data across the entire force in real time. What works once stops working. How do you counter a force that learns continuously? You be unpredictable, Adama said. And you accept that you're going to take hits. He looked at the base star positions. General, your frigates, rotate your firing solutions. Don't repeat the same targeting sequence. Make them keep updating their model instead of acting on a complete one. There was a pause on De Solis's channel that Adama had learned to recognize as a Turian officer encountering advice they hadn't expected to find useful and recalibrating accordingly. Adjusting fire pattern, De Solis said. The unbroken resolve changed its firing rhythm. Not random, Turian commanders didn't do random, but varied in a way that was structured enough to be tactically coherent and irregular enough to keep the base star's predictive systems perpetually behind the curve. It worked. Not perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly against Cylons. But the second base star's maneuvering became fractionally less efficient, and fractionally less efficient against a mass accelerator at range was measurably more damage absorbed. It was Williams who noticed it first. Adama, he said, on the command channel, quietly enough that it felt private despite being transmitted across the system. The base stars. They're not just fighting us. Adama looked at the draughties. The base star positions had shifted. Not toward the civilian fleet, not toward Galactica, but in a configuration that was three-dimensional in a way that colonial tactical training parsed as encirclement but that the geometry of the system didn't quite support for a purely offensive purpose. They're mapping us, Adama said. The whole system, Williams confirmed. Relay position. Planet. Our ship configurations. They're building a complete tactical picture. They do this when they're planning for the next engagement, Adama said. This isn't just a pursuit force. This is a reconnaissance in force. He said it with the flatness of a man delivering a diagnosis. Whatever comes next will be larger. Williams absorbed this. How much larger? Adama looked at the three base stars on his draughties. Battered now, one of them showing significant hull damage from Turian fire, raiders thinning as Starbuck's wing and Galactica's point defense worked their way through the first wave numbers. By any objective measure, the engagement was going as well as could be expected. By Adama's measure, which was calibrated to what came after, it was a warning. Large enough that today's conversation about sanctuary and protocol and relay violations becomes irrelevant, he said, because there won't be a Shanxi to have it over. He made a decision, the kind he made by feel rather than calculation, or rather, by a calculus so internalized that it no longer felt like math. General Williams. General Arterius. I need to tell you something about the Cylons that I haven't told you yet, because I was hoping it wouldn't be immediately relevant. Both channels went quiet. The humanoid models, Adama said. They've already been in contact with your systems for as long as we've been in this system. They don't need to breach your ships to access your networks. They need to breach your people. Another silence. Longer. Are you saying, Williams said carefully, that one of my personnel could be? I'm saying it's possible, Adama said. And I'm saying that the way you find out is not something anyone finds easy to hear. He paused. I can have my medical officer transmit the detection protocol. It requires a blood test. Another pause, because this part never got easier regardless of how many times he'd had to say it. The results change how you see people you thought you knew. I want you to be prepared for that before you run it. In Shanxi's underground shelter, 8,000 children sat in the particular restless quiet of young people who understood that something serious was happening above them and were maintaining the courage of people who trusted the adults in charge to handle it. Hera Agathon sat with her back against a concrete wall and her hands flat on the floor, and she was humming something softly. A tune that made the woman sitting next to her, a Shanxi colonist named Park who had 3 children of her own, turn and listen with an expression she couldn't quite explain. The tune was familiar. Park was almost certain she'd never heard it before. The blood tests came back in 90 minutes. Dr. Cottle ran them aboard Galactica with the systematic efficiency of a man who had long since made his peace with the fact that his job required him to tell people things that broke them, and who had decided that the most merciful approach was speed and precision rather than gentleness. Gentleness, in Cottle's experience, was what you offered after. During, you needed accuracy. The colonial results were clean. 49,810 survivors, 2 had died in the engagement, a fact Cottle noted in his log with the careful handwriting of someone who believed that the record was the minimum dignity owed to the dead, tested against the silent detection markers that Baltar's original protocol had established and refined through 4 years of increasingly desperate application. Clean. The Alliance personnel were different. Not because any of them were Cylons. They weren't, the test confirmed that, and Williams received the results with the particular relief of a commander who had been holding his breath without knowing it. But the test required explaining, and explaining required a conversation that Williams had with his senior staff in a briefing room that went very quiet very quickly as the implications assembled themselves. Humanoid synthetic soldiers. Biologically indistinguishable. Already deployed, historically, within human populations. Capable of living entire lives without self-knowledge of their nature. They could be anywhere, Williams's intelligence officer said. Not an accusation. A statement of scope. They have been everywhere, Adama said, on the channel they'd patched through to the briefing room. In our governments. Our military commands. Our religious leadership. We found them. We didn't find all of them in time. He paused. The ones we found in time are the ones that didn't finish what they started. The intelligence officer looked at Williams. Williams looked at the table. We need to transmit this to Alliance Command, he said. And to the Council. Yes, Adama said. You do. And when you do, I need you to transmit something else alongside it, because the Council is going to want to contain this information, and containing it is exactly what the Cylons need them to do. On the Unbroken Resolve, De Solis Arturius received the Cylon detection protocol, read it twice, and made 3 decisions in rapid sequence with the administrative economy of a Turian commander who understood that speed of decision was itself a tactical resource. First, he transmitted the full engagement report and the Colonial Fleet's dossier to the hierarchies pre-march with a priority designation that would put it in front of the right people within the hour. Second, he ordered his own medical staff to prepare to run the detection protocol on his crew, understanding that the probability of infiltration was low but that low probability and zero probability were different things and the difference mattered. Third, he requested a direct communication with Admiral Adama. Not through the 3-way channel. Direct. Adama took the call in his quarters. The same quarters where he'd sat with Ty and the bourbon that was only technically bourbon, where the photograph of his son still stood on the desk at the angle it always stood, where Galactica's structural breathing was a constant low note beneath everything. De Solis's face on the screen was cleaner now, better camera, better translation rendering, and Adama could see more clearly what he'd been reading through the pixelation in their earlier exchanges. A senior military officer. Old by human standards, though Adama had already been told that Turian aging didn't map neatly to human aging. Eyes that had seen campaigns. A bearing that was formal in the particular way of someone for whom formality was not performance but architecture, the structure their professionalism was built on. Admiral, de Solas said. Off the record. Adama recognized the register. Off the record. The hierarchy is going to want your fleet contained, de Solas said. Not harmed. Contained. The relay activation, the unknown military force, the synthetic enemy you've brought into Citadel space, there will be members of the Primarch's Council who will argue that the safest response is to impound your vessels and relocate your people to a monitored facility while the Council determines what to do with you. Adama looked at him steadily. And your assessment? My assessment, de Solas said, is that you are 49,000 refugees with functional jump drives, nuclear weapons, and 18 years of combat experience against an enemy that has just demonstrated the ability to adapt to Turian mass accelerator tactics in real time. He paused. Containing you would be tactically wasteful and logistically complex. Working with you would be neither of those things. You're going to argue for cooperation, Adama said. I'm going to argue for pragmatism, de Solas said. Which in this case produces the same result. His mandibles shifted in the expression Adama had begun to read as the Turian equivalent of a careful smile. I wanted you to know that argument was being made. So that when the hierarchy's response arrives and it is more restrictive than you would prefer, you understand that it is not the only position in the room. Adama was quiet for a moment. General, he said, in 4 years of running, I have dealt with politicians and priests and black marketeers and a former terrorist who built herself a city on a stolen space station. I have worked with people whose ethics I found repugnant and against people I admired. He looked at de Solas directly. The only currency I've ever trusted is what someone actually does when the shooting starts. You adjusted your firing pattern when I asked. You ran the detection protocol without being ordered to. He paused. That's enough for me. De Solas inclined his head, a gesture the translation system didn't annotate, but that read, in the universal language of military acknowledgement, as understood and reciprocated. The shooting had not stopped while they were talking. The 3 silent base stars had pulled back to a distance that kept them outside the Unbroken Resolve's optimal engagement range while they cycled fresh raider wings and repaired hull damage, which was a silent tactical behavior Adama knew well. They didn't retreat, they reconsolidated, and the difference mattered because reconsolidation ended and retreat didn't. Starbuck brought her wing back to Galactica in stages, 4 Vipers at a time, rotating through rapid rearming and refueling while the others maintained the engagement perimeter, and landed in the port bay with the controlled chaos efficiency of pilots who had been doing this since before the word efficient felt adequate to describe it. She was out of her cockpit before the ground crew had the ladder in place, pulling her helmet off, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, her eyes already moving to the Draughty's repeater on the bay wall. They're repositioning, she told Tyrol, who was already under her Viper with a diagnostic scanner. Not retreating. Repositioning. I know, Tyrol said, from under the ship. We've got maybe 2 hours before they come back in strength. She looked at the 12 reserve Vipers lined up along the bay wall, in various states of assembly. How many? 8, Tyrol said. Maybe 9 if the Tilium feed on the last one cooperates. Make it 9, Starbuck said, and walked toward the briefing room. The briefing that followed was where the shape of the next problem became clear. The silent reconnaissance pattern confirms it, Gaeta said, his stylus moving across the tactical display with the neat precision of someone who communicated best through diagrams. They're not pursuing the fleet anymore. The fleet isn't the objective. He circled the Shanxi system on the display. This is the relay. The planet. The Alliance presence. He looked up. We led them here, and now they want it. The room absorbed this. They've never done this before, Hot Dog said. He was still technically grounded. He was in the briefing room anyway, and Adama had looked the other way again, because grounding a pilot for a battle they were already in the middle of was a philosophical position rather than a practical one. They've never had a reason to, Adama said. In our space, there was nothing worth holding. Ships, yes. Planets they could occupy, yes. But a node in a network of faster-than-light transit points that connects thousands of systems? He shook his head. That's a different kind of objective. They want the relay, Starbuck said flatly. They want access to whatever the relay connects to, Adama said. Which is apparently an entire galaxy. He let that sit for a moment. General Williams. What happens if a silent force gains control of Relay 314? Williams's voice came through the briefing room speaker with the careful weight of someone answering a question they would have preferred not to have been asked. Relay 314 connects to 7 other systems in this cluster. From those systems, you can reach 40 more. And from those, he stopped. If they can navigate the relay network, Admiral, there is no part of Citadel space that is not accessible to them. The silence in the briefing room had the particular quality of people doing math they didn't want to finish. Then we can't let them have it, Adama said. It was not a complicated statement. It was the same statement he'd been making in different forms since Caprica. We cannot let them have this, whatever this is, because what they do with it is what they've always done with everything. Which means we need to be able to hold this system against a force that is going to be significantly larger than 3 base stars. He looked around the room. What do we have? What they had was this. 49 Vipers, 8 of them just off Tyrol's assembly line and technically unproven in combat. 3 Turian warships with mass accelerator weapons that had proven effective and crew that had just completed their first real engagement against an enemy unlike anything in Citadel tactical history. 2 Alliance frigates with networked systems now manually isolated, running at degraded efficiency. 1 aging Battlestar with 2.3% Tilium reserves, a hull that Tyrol described in his latest report as character-rich, and a crew that had been awake for 22 hours. And Laura Roslin, who walked into the briefing room at that moment with a data tablet in her hand and the expression she got when she had done something politically significant and wasn't sure how it was going to land. I've been in communication with the Citadel Council, she said. Every head in the room turned. Through Administrator Devereaux's QEC link, she said. I requested an emergency session. I've been granted a preliminary audience with the Aseri Counselor. She paused. Her name is Tevos. She has questions. Another pause, briefer. She also said something I think you all need to hear. She looked at Adama. She said the Aseri have religious texts that describe a cycle. A great harvest, conducted by synthetic beings, recurring across geological time. Her voice was steady and her eyes were not. She wants to know if the Cylons are the harvesters. The briefing room was very quiet. Adama thought about the Cylon god. About the scriptures that had guided them across the dark. About Kara Thrace, who had died and returned with music in her hands. About the pattern underneath everything that he had never quite been willing to call a plan because calling it a plan meant accepting that someone had planned it, and he was not ready, had never been ready, for what that implied. Tell her no, he said finally. You're certain? Roslin asked. The Cylons aren't harvesters, he said. There's something we made. He looked at the Draughty's display, at the 3 base stars holding at the system's edge, waiting. Whatever the texts are describing, it isn't them. He didn't say, but it might be something that's been watching all of this very carefully. He didn't say it because he wasn't certain enough to say it, and because some possibilities needed to be thought about quietly before they were spoken aloud, and because Galactica's Draughties had just chirped with a new contact resolution that Gaeta was reading with the expression he got when the news was bad. Admiral, Gaeta said. The base stars are moving again. The Cylon force came back in with 1,200 raiders and a tactical patience that was more frightening than aggression. They didn't rush. Rushing was an organic impulse, the product of adrenaline, of fear, of the biological machinery that turned threat into velocity. Cylons didn't have adrenaline. They had processing time and shared consciousness and the cold geometric certainty of a mind that had looked at the previous engagement, absorbed every variable, and returned with adjustments. The raiders came in 3 waves this time, separated by intervals calculated to keep Galactica's point defense batteries cycling rather than firing. Press, pause, a rhythm designed to find the gaps in a defense system the way water finds cracks in stone. Adama watched the pattern develop on Drades and felt the particular sensation he associated with silent tactical evolution. Not fear exactly, but the heightened alertness of someone who had learned that the enemy's patience was the most dangerous thing about them. "They've adjusted for our point defense rotation," he said. "I see it," Starbuck said, from the flight deck, already in her Viper. "They're going to bracket us. First wave draws our starboard batteries, second wave hits the gap, third wave goes for the civilian ships. Counter. We rotate the Viper screen 40 degrees and let them hit the batteries. Make them think they've found the gap. A pause. Then we close it when the second wave commits. You'll be flying directly into the second wave's approach vector." "Yeah," Starbuck said, with the tone of someone who considered this a technical detail rather than a problem. Adama authorized it because it was the right call and because arguing with Starbuck about acceptable personal risk was a conversation that had never produced useful results in 20 years of trying. On the unbroken resolve, De Solis was running a different calculation. The Turian engagement doctrine that had served the hierarchy for 3 centuries was built on the premise of technological superiority at range, mass accelerator weapons that outperformed anything an opponent could field, kinetic barriers that absorbed return fire, and the fire discipline of a species that treated marksmanship as a cultural value rather than a professional skill. Against the Cylon-based stars, 2 of these 3 premises held. The third, kinetic barriers, was proving complicated. The Cylon raiders had adapted their attack runs after the first engagement, concentrating fire on barrier emitters rather than trying to punch through barriers at full strength. It was a methodical approach, the kind of approach that required patience and the ability to treat individual raiders as expendable components rather than pilots to be preserved, and it was working. The unbroken Resolve's port barrier emitters were running at 60%. The frigate Arenchas were at 43%. "They're learning our barrier architecture," his tactical officer said. The officer's voice had the controlled flatness of a Turian professional managing a response that their training hadn't fully prepared them for. "They learn everything," De Solis said. "The question is whether we can make what they learn useless fast enough." He looked at the engagement plot, at the Colonial Vipers weaving through the debris field, at Galactica holding the center of the defensive formation like a load-bearing wall. An old ship. Visibly old, the kind of age that spoke not of obsolescence but of continuous survival, which was a different thing entirely. "Coordinate with Galactica. Tell Adama I'm moving the unbroken Resolve inside its standard engagement range." His tactical officer looked at him. "Sir, that puts us inside optimal raider attack distance." "Yes," De Solis said. "It also gives us firing solutions on raider formations that their attack geometry doesn't account for, because their tactical model was built on the assumption that we'd stay at range." He pulled up the firing plot. "They've learned where we've been. We're going to be somewhere else." It was, his tactical officer reflected, the most colonial-sounding tactical decision he'd ever heard a Turian officer make. He executed it without saying so. The second wave of raiders hit Starbuck's screen 3 minutes into the engagement and found it not where they'd calculated it would be. Starbuck had pulled her wing back 50 kilometers and then accelerated directly into the wave's approach vector at a closing speed that made the silent targeting systems flag her formation as anomalous. Not because the math was wrong but because the math said no organic pilot would willingly choose this approach angle, and the silent tactical model had 18 years of data on what organic pilots willingly chose. Starbuck was not interested in the model's expectations. She hit the wave's leading edge and fired continuously. Not with the measured precision of a pilot conserving ammunition, but with the aggressive economy of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether the strategy worked and that conservation was somebody else's problem after that. Vipers peeled off left and right around her, each pilot executing the dispersal pattern they drilled in the briefing, and the Raider wave, designed to hit a consolidated point defense gap. Found instead a distributed screen of 46 Vipers filling exactly the space it had calculated to be empty. The third wave, which had been timed to come through the gap behind the second, arrived to find the gap occupied and adjusted, but adjusting took processing time, even for Silence, and in the processing time the unbroken Resolve had moved inside its standard engagement range and its mass accelerator was firing at Raider concentrations from an angle that the base star's defensive raiders were not positioned to cover. The combination worked. For 4 minutes, it worked beautifully. The kind of 4 minutes that happened occasionally in combat, when everything aligned and the plan functioned as intended and the enemy was briefly, purely, on the wrong end of a decision they couldn't immediately counter. Then the base stars adapted. They adapted by doing what Adama had always known they would eventually do, which was stop treating the Vipers as the primary threat and start treating Galactica as the primary threat. The targeting shift was visible on Drades as a pattern change. Raiders that had been engaging the Viper screen began pulling back and regrouping, not retreating but repositioning, concentrating into a strike package aimed at Galactica's drive section. Not the weapons. Not the flight pods. The drives. They're going for mobility, Tai said. They want us stationary, Adama said. Stationary and alive. They need the ship's population intact. He understood the logic with the bone-deep familiarity of 4 years of being hunted. They're shifting from destruction to capture. They want the civilians, Tai said. They want the numbers, Adama said. 49,000 people. He looked at the Drades. Get me a firing solution on the lead base star's communication array. Tai blinked. There. If we destroy their primary communication array, the force loses real-time consensus. They continue fighting but they fight independently, not collectively. The adaptation rate drops significantly. He was already moving toward the weapons console. We have 1 nuclear warhead left. 1. We've been carrying it since the Resurrection Hub. He looked at Tai. I didn't want to use it until I was certain it would matter. Tai held his gaze for a moment, doing the math that soldiers did when they were looking at an irreversible decision. It'll matter, he said. The request Adama made next was the one he'd been building toward without quite knowing it since the moment Gaeta had first read the Turian contact off Drades. The request that required the most trust in people he had known for the shortest time. General Arterius, he said, on the direct channel. I need a firing lane. The Solas understood immediately. You want clear space between Galactica and the lead base star. 3 minutes. Long enough to get a clean shot on their communications array. He paused. Your frigates are currently in my firing solution. There was a silence on de Solas's end that lasted 4 seconds. Which was, in the context of a battle in which things were changing every 15, a very long silence. Orentia, Coram, de Solas said, on his own tactical channel. Pull back to Mark 7. Give the Battlestar a lane. The Turian frigates moved without question, the precise, immediate execution of orders that came from a military culture that had decided, centuries ago, that the moment between order and action should be as short as physics allowed. They opened a corridor of space between Galactica's forward weapons array and the lead base star that was 2 kilometers wide and exactly long enough. Adama said, fire. Galactica's last nuclear warhead left its tube on a trajectory that Gaeta had calculated with the focused intensity of someone who understood that last was a word that meant no second attempt. It crossed the corridor in 47 seconds, and the Turian frigates watched it pass between them, and it hit the base star's communication array with the precision of a calculation that had been made correctly the first time. The explosion was visible across the system. The lead base star's raider formations immediately lost their collective coherence, not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably, in the way that a sentence loses meaning when you remove the grammar. Individual raiders continued fighting. But the shared nervous system that had been threading 1,200 of them into a single adaptive organism was fragmented, and fragmented was the difference between a force that learned and a force that executed, and execution without adaptation was something the Colonial Fleet knew how to fight. It was something the Turian Hierarchy knew how to fight. It was something 2 Alliance frigates and a colony garrison, operating at degraded efficiency with manually isolated systems and crew who had never seen combat before this morning, were learning to fight in real time with a speed that Williams, watching from Shanxi's command post, found himself thinking about in terms he hadn't expected. They're good, he thought. They're actually very good. He filed it for the report he was already composing in his head. The report that was going to reach Admiral Hackett and the Alliance Parliament and eventually the Citadel Council and reshape everything everyone thought they knew about humanity's place in the galaxy, because there were now 2 of them, 2 human civilizations, and they were different in ways that mattered and the same in ways that mattered more. The battle turned in the next 20 minutes. Not ended, turned. The 3 base stars were still functional, the raiders still numerous, the Centurion boarding attempt still ongoing against 2 civilian ships that Galactica's Marines had been holding by main force for the past hour in corridors that were not designed for that kind of fighting. But the loss of the lead base star's communication array had changed the engagement's character from a grinding adaptive pressure to something more like a conventional military confrontation, and conventional military confrontations were things that Turian mass accelerator weapons and colonial combat experience and Alliance frigates were collectively equipped to handle. De Solas pressed the high anchor advantage. Starbuck pressed the debris field. Williams pressed the planet's gravity well, positioning his frigates where the geometry forced incoming raiders into approach vectors that compressed their formations. And Galactica held the center, old and battered and absolutely immovable, her hull reading new damage in a dozen places, her port flight pod running on emergency power, her crew operating with the focused economy of people who had stopped asking whether they could do this and were simply doing it. It was in this moment that the Citadel Council's emergency response arrived. Not ships, not yet, the distances involved made ships impossible in this time frame. But a transmission, carried through the QEC relay that Williams had been using to maintain contact with Earth and the Council, and addressed to all commanding officers in the Shanxi system simultaneously. It was from Counselor Tevos. It was 3 sentences. The Council recognizes the extraordinary circumstances in the Shanxi system. A diplomatic envoy is being dispatched immediately. All parties are requested to maintain current positions and cease offensive operations pending Council review. Adama read it on the CIC screen and said nothing for a moment. Then, do the Cylons know they're supposed to stop? Tai almost smiled. The Cylons did not stop. The Council's transmission, whatever diplomatic weight it carried across the civilizations that recognized the Council's authority, was not a variable in Cylon tactical processing. The base stars continued their pattern. Raiders cycling, hull repairs progressing, the 2 remaining communication arrays threading adaptation data through the force with the methodical patience of a mind that did not experience fatigue or political pressure or the particular human exhaustion of a battle that had been going on long enough to stop feeling like a battle and start feeling like a condition of existence. What the transmission did was clarify something for everyone else. Williams read it and understood that the Alliance's margin for independent decision-making had just narrowed significantly. The Council was involved now, which meant that every action taken in the Shanxi system for the foreseeable future would be evaluated not just on its military merit but on its political implication, and political implication was a currency that spent differently than tactical advantage. De Solas read it and understood that the hierarchy's response, when it came, would be shaped by whatever the Council had already decided, which meant the window for pragmatic field decisions was closing. He looked at the engagement plot, at Galactica holding the center, at the Colonial Vipers still working the debris field, at the damage his frigates had absorbed and delivered. And made the decision that field commanders make when they recognize that the people above them are about to make things more complicated. He transmitted a full engagement assessment to the Primarch, marked it with the designation that meant act on this before the politicians do, and went back to the battle. Adama read the council transmission last, because Gaeta had printed it rather than reading it aloud, and Adama had looked at it for a long moment before folding it and putting it in his jacket pocket with the particular gesture of a man filing something under. Deal with this later. Tai, he said. What's artillery status? Tai checked. 1.8%. 1.8%. Less than one jump. Less than one real jump. A precision transit to a calculated destination, the kind that required margin. What 1.8% actually bought them was an emergency jump to a position they couldn't predict and couldn't correct from, which was tactically equivalent to hoping the universe was feeling generous. They were not going to jump. Which meant they were going to finish this here. The decision that shaped the next hour came not from Galactica's CIC but from a converted storage bay on the civilian ship Adriatic, where a man named Galen Tyrol was doing something that he had been doing in various forms since before the war, taking pieces of things that existed and assembling them into something that shouldn't be possible but was. Tyrol had 12 Vipers in various states of completion, 9 of which he declared combat ready for the earlier engagement. The remaining 3 were in a state he had previously described as aspirational. In the 4 hours since that assessment, working with 2 of his best deck crew and 1 Shanxi colonist who turned out to have an instinct for colonial propulsion systems that Tyrol found both useful and slightly unsettling, he had moved one of the 3 from aspirational to probable. He called up to CIC on the internal line. Admiral. I've got one more bird. Condition. Tilium feed is patched with Alliance-compatible tubing that I'm choosing to trust. Cannon calibration is close enough that I'd call it good at ranges under 4 kilometers. Landing gear is decorative. A pause. She'll fly and she'll fight. I make no promises about the landing. Who's flying her? A longer pause. I was thinking I might. Adama was quiet for a moment. Tyrol was his chief, his irreplaceable, foundational chief, the man whose hands held Galactica together with equal parts engineering and will. He was also a man who had been a soldier before he'd been a mechanic, who had fought on New Caprica and lost things there that he was still carrying, and who had the look, when he said I was thinking I might, of a man who needed to be in the fight rather than adjacent to it. Get in your bird, Chief, Adama said. The engagement's final phase began when the second Cylon base star, the one that had absorbed the heaviest Turian fire throughout the battle, made a decision that reflected either damage to its tactical processing or a strategic calculation that was difficult to read from the outside. It broke from the formation and moved directly toward Shanxi. Not toward Galactica. Not toward the Turian cruiser. Toward the planet, at a speed that suggested it was accepting fire to get there, that the objective was worth the cost of the approach. It's going for the relay, Gaeta said. If it can get inside the relay's activation threshold, it can transmit the relay's coordinates to the rest of the Cylon fleet, Adama said. Every base star they have. He was already on the tactical channel. General Arterius. The second base star is moving on the relay. Everything we have needs to go on that ship. Agreed, De Solis said, and his voice had the quality of a Turian officer for whom agreed was a complete sentence and the execution was already happening. The unbroken resolve turned on its axis with the ponderous precision of a vessel whose mass was measured in thousands of tons and whose crew moved it like a scalpel regardless. Its main gun recharged, the cycling sound audible on internal sensors as a deep harmonic that Turian crew described as the ship thinking, and fired a sustained salvo at the advancing base star that was the most concentrated mass accelerator fire the engagement had seen. It slowed the base star. It didn't stop it. Starbuck, Adama said. I see it, she said. What followed was not in any Colonial Flight manual and would not have been approved by any Colonial Flight instructor who had a career they wanted to preserve. Starbuck took her wing, 14 Vipers, Tyrol's patched-together bird on her port flank making sounds that she would later describe as characterful, and flew a direct interdiction course between the advancing base star and the relay. Not a harassment run. An interdiction. Placing the Viper formation physically between the base star and its objective and inviting it to fire through them. It was the kind of tactic that worked because it forced the enemy to make a calculation between two objectives it couldn't simultaneously achieve: destroy the intercepting fighters, or continue toward the goal. If the Cylons continued toward the relay, the Vipers were in point-blank firing range of a base star's hull, not the Raiders, the hull. And at point-blank range, Viper autocannons could do things to base star hull sections that they couldn't do at standard engagement distance. If the Cylons slowed to engage the Vipers, they gave the Unbroken Resolve time to bring its full salvo weight onto the base star's drive section. There was no good option. That was the point. The base star chose to engage the Vipers. The next 11 minutes were the most intense of the battle. Starbuck's wing at point-blank range against a base star that was also launching every raider it had left was not a situation that Tactical Doctrine had a clean answer for, because Tactical Doctrine was generally constructed around the premise that surviving the engagement was a goal rather than a secondary consideration. Starbuck operated on the premise that surviving was preferable but that the base star not reaching the relay was the actual goal, and the difference between those two premises was where the 11 minutes lived. 3 Vipers were lost. Not the pilots, 2 ejected cleanly and 1 managed a controlled tumble that put the cockpit into Galactica's recovery net rather than into the base star's hull. But 3 Vipers gone, 3 fewer guns in the formation, and Starbuck redistributed the coverage without breaking the interdiction line, flying her own bird into the gaps as they opened with the instinctive geometry of someone who processed three-dimensional space the way other people processed walking. Tyrol's patched bird lasted 9 of the 11 minutes before the Tilium feed that he'd chosen to trust made its own assessment of the situation and disagreed with his confidence. The engine flamed out. The cannon kept firing, reserve power, until it didn't. Tyrol rode the unpowered Viper in a ballistic arc that took him away from the base star and toward Galactica's landing bay, and the landing gear that he described as decorative performed its function in the technical sense that it was present when the ship contacted the deck, which was the most that could be said for it. The deck crew had him out of the cockpit in 40 seconds and were checking him for injuries when he pushed them off and looked at the Draughty's repeater. "Did it hold?" he asked. "Still holding," the deck crew chief said. Tyrol nodded and sat down on the deck with his back against his ruined Viper's landing strut and watched the display. The Unbroken Resolve hit the slowing base star's drive section with its 8th sustained salvo, and something gave. Not a dramatic explosion, Adama had long since let go of the cinematic version of what silent ship destruction looked like. What actually happened was structural. The drive section lost coherence, power redistribution failed to compensate, and the base star began a slow rotation that its maneuvering thrusters couldn't correct. It was still firing. Its raiders were still flying. But it was no longer moving toward the relay, and it was not going to reach the relay, and the tactical processing that it was sharing with the other 2 base stars updated in real time with a flag that meant this objective is no longer achievable. The Cylons began to withdraw. Not a rout, organized, their covering raiders pulling back in the sequence that colonial pilots recognized as the prelude to a jump calculation, the way you recognized a person preparing to leave by the way they gathered themselves before standing. The 2 functional base stars collected their remaining raiders and moved to jump distance, and the damaged base star, drive section failing, followed on emergency power. They jumped. Galactica's Draughties went quiet except for the residual contacts of debris and the 3 ejected pilots' emergency beacons and the thermal signature of the damaged base star's last position, cooling in space like a question mark. In Galactica's CIC, no one said anything for a moment. Then Gaeta said, very quietly, "Contacts clear. System is clean." The CIC crew held the silence for one more second, the second that belonged to the people who hadn't made it back, which was a tradition on Galactica as old as the war, as old as the understanding that victory and loss were not opposites but companions, and then they began the work of assessing what they had and what they'd used and what they needed and what could be repaired. Williams's voice came through the combined channel with the controlled relief of a man who had just completed his first combat engagement and was performing the assessment of what it had cost before he allowed himself to feel anything about what it had accomplished. "Galactica, this is Shanxi Actual. Cylons have withdrawn from the system. My frigates are intact. We have casualties, I'll have numbers shortly. A pause. Admiral. I need to say something. Go ahead, General. In 30 years of Alliance service, I have never seen anything like what your crew just did. Another pause, briefer. I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. Adama looked at the Draughties, at the clean screen, at the system that was still intact, at the relay in the outer system that was still dark and undamaged and connected to a galaxy that had no idea what had just been decided in its name. Your people held too, he said. Tell them that. He set down the handset and turned to Tai, who was looking at the damage assessment with the expression of a man who had added up a column of numbers and found the total acceptable by the only standard that mattered, which was that it was survivable. How are we? Adama asked. We're here, Tai said. It was enough. It was always enough. Outside, through Galactica's battered hull, the Shanxi system was quiet. The relay sat in the outer dark, patient and ancient, connecting this moment to everything that came next. And in the space where 3 silent base stars had been, there was nothing, just the slow dissipation of engine plasma and the soft signal of emergency beacons and the particular silence of a battle that had ended before its consequences had fully begun. Somewhere in the deep dark beyond the system's edge, 3 base stars were jumping toward whatever waited behind them, carrying everything they had learned. The Citadel Council's envoy arrived 6 days later. 6 days was fast, by the standards of a galactic government that administered thousands of species across hundreds of systems, fast enough to communicate that the Council understood the situation's weight, slow enough to communicate that the Council was going to approach it on its own terms rather than anyone else's. The envoy ship was an Asari diplomatic cruiser, elegant in the way that Asari engineering was always elegant, its lines suggesting thought rather than force, and it dropped out of FTL at the system's edge and requested a formal welcome that the combined Shanxi Colonial Turian command structure spent approximately 4 hours debating how to provide before Williams made an executive decision and simply extended it. Councillor Tevos came aboard Shanxi's main administrative building in person, which was itself a statement. Council envoys traditionally conducted initial meetings aboard neutral vessels, and choosing to come to the surface meant either that she was making a gesture of trust or that she had assessed the situation closely enough to know that the Colonial Fleet needed to see someone step onto ground rather than conduct diplomacy from orbit. Adama, watching her walk across the landing pad with the particular fluid grace of a species that had been navigating galactic politics since before humanity had invented writing, suspected it was both. She was older than she looked, which he had been told was true of all Asari, and she looked at everything, at the Alliance personnel, at the colonial survivors moving through Shanxi's settlement, at the children who had been brought up from the shelters and were now occupying every open space the colony had with the voracious physical energy of young people making up for lost time, with eyes that carried a quality Adama recognized from Roslin. The quality of someone who had been doing something very difficult for a very long time and had found the discipline to keep doing it, and was not interested in being thanked for that because thanks were not the point. She shook Roslin's hand first. Then Adama's. Then Williams's. Then she looked at Desola's Arterius, who had come down from the Unbroken Resolve in full Turian formal attire that made the Alliance dress uniforms look understated, and inclined her head in a specific way that Adama had already learned meant something significant in a Asari diplomatic register. General Arterius, she said. The hierarchy's preliminary report was thorough. You made several decisions in the field that the Council will want to discuss. I'm aware, Desola said, with the equanimity of a military officer who had made the decisions he'd made and was prepared to account for them. They were the right decisions, Tevos said, and moved on before Desola's could respond, which Adama suspected was deliberate. The formal session lasted 9 hours. It was conducted in the largest room Shanxi's administrative building had, around a table that had been designed for colony planning meetings and was now holding the most consequential diplomatic conversation in human history, which it managed with the quiet adaptability of good furniture. Translators worked in real time. Asari linguists who had spent the 6 days in transit learning colonial standard from recordings Williams had transmitted, producing a result that was functional if occasionally creative in its interpretive choices. Tebos asked her questions with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that the decisions made in this room would be cited for centuries, and who wanted the record to be accurate. She asked about the 12 colonies, and Roslin answered. She asked about the Silent War, and Adama answered. She asked about the theological framework that had guided the fleet, the scriptures, the prophecies, the star charts burned into a dead woman's memory, and both of them answered, trading sentences with the ease of two people who had been processing the same impossible experience from different angles for years and had developed a shorthand for it. When she asked about the Silence, their capabilities, their objectives, their demonstrated willingness and ability to infiltrate organic populations, the room got very quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when information is landing that changes the shape of everything around it. The humanoid models, Tebos said, carefully. You're certain they could pass undetected in any human population? In any population that doesn't know to look for them, Adama said. And in some that do. Could they pass in non-human populations? Adama looked at her steadily. We don't know. We've never encountered a non-human silent model. That doesn't mean they don't exist. Tebos held this thought for a moment with the visible discipline of someone choosing not to show what it cost them. The detection protocol your medical officer developed, she said. Would you share it with the council? Yes, Adama said. Unconditionally. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been expecting a negotiation and was recalibrating. Unconditionally. Counselor, the Silence are not a problem we brought you. They're a problem that followed us here. The distinction matters morally, but the practical reality is the same. They are in your galaxy now, and everything your civilization knows about what they can do, it should know. He paused. We have no interest in being the people who had information that could have helped and chose to use it as leverage. Roslin, beside him, said nothing. She'd heard this quality in Adama before, the absolute bedrock of it, the place where his pragmatism and his integrity became the same thing. And she'd learned that when he reached it, the most useful thing she could do was let him occupy it without interruption. The political architecture of what followed took the full 9 hours to sketch and would take years to build. The Colonial Fleet would be granted provisional sanctuary in the Shanxi system pending a permanent determination by the full council. Shanxi's resources would be supplemented by emergency alliance supply runs. A commitment Williams had already begun implementing without waiting for formal authorization, and which the council retrospectively approved with the slightly embarrassed efficiency of a governing body catching up to something good that had already happened. Colonial military vessels would operate under a status of Allied Irregular Force, a classification the council's lawyers had apparently invented during the 6-day transit specifically for this situation. In exchange, full intelligence sharing on silent capabilities, tactics, and known variants. The silent detection protocol, unrestricted. And cooperation with the Council's investigation into what Tebos carefully described as the theological resonances between colonial scripture and certain pre-existing Council records, which was the diplomatic phrasing for the conversation that Adama had known was coming since the moment Roslin had told him about the Aseri religious texts. It was Tebos herself who raised it directly, at the session's 8th hour, when the formal business had been largely resolved and the room had settled into the particular exhausted candor of people who had been talking for a long time and had stopped performing. Admiral, she said. Your scriptures. The cycle of death and rebirth. The gods who guided your people across the dark. Yes, Adama said. There are texts in the Aseri archives, she said carefully, that describe something similar. Not identical, the framing is different, the metaphysical architecture is different. But the pattern. She paused. A cycle. Synthetic beings. Harvest. And beneath all of it, something older than the cycle itself, which the texts describe as, the translation is imperfect, the weight behind the mechanism. Adama thought about Kara Thrace, standing in CIC with starlight in her eyes, punching coordinates into a NAV computer with the certainty of someone receiving rather than choosing. I'd like to read those texts, he said. I thought you might, Tebos said. After the session, Adama walked alone through Shanxi's settlement in the early evening, which was a thing he'd been unable to do for 4 years, walk alone, outside, under an atmosphere, in something approaching peace. The settlement was busy in the way that places with too many people and not enough space are always busy, but it was a different kind of busy than Galactica's corridors. It had the quality of something growing rather than something sustaining, which was a distinction that mattered more than he'd known it mattered until he felt the difference. He passed a building where colonial children and Shanxi children were eating together at long tables, the communication between them conducted in the universal language of people who are young enough that shared experience outweighs linguistic barrier. He passed a group of Galactica crew sitting with Shanxi colonists, exchanging the kind of stories that people exchange when they are trying to understand each other's world by offering pieces of their own. He passed Hera Agathon, who was standing in the same patch of grass where she'd pressed her hands into the earth on the day they'd arrived, in the fading light, humming the tune that had no name. He stopped. She looked up at him with the eyes she'd inherited from 2 impossible directions. Her mother's human certainty, her father's hope, and the tune continued for a moment, threading through the evening air with the quality of something that had always been there and was only now being heard. "What is that?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I just know it." He stood with her for a moment in the evening light, the old admiral and the child who was the living proof that the wall between created and creator was not a wall but a door, and the tune moved through the air between them, and he thought about cycles and about what lay beneath them, and about the relay sitting in the outer dark of this system, connecting this moment to 50,000 years of something that was either pattern or plan, and he found he could not determine which, and discovered that he had made a kind of peace with not knowing. Not acceptance. Not resolution. Peace, the working kind, the kind you carry rather than arrive at. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were appearing in the darkening blue, and somewhere up there Galactica was in orbit, old and battered and still flying, and somewhere beyond the system's edge the Cylons were regrouping with everything they'd learned, and somewhere in the deep dark of the galaxy's arm, things that were 50,000 years old and did not sleep were running calculations that had just returned an error for the first time in recorded history, and the error was this. New variable. Unclassified. Origin, external. Threat assessment, inconclusive. Recommend, observe. Hera Agathon hummed her nameless tune into the Shanxi evening. And the stars came out, one by one, over a galaxy that had just become something it hadn't been the week before, larger, more complicated, more dangerous, and more alive. The Colonial Fleet had crossed the darkness between stars looking for Earth and found instead something no scripture had prepared them for, a galaxy already full of life, already deep in its own ancient struggles, already balanced on the edge of a cycle that made the Cylon War look like a prologue. They had arrived broken. 49,000 souls in ships held together by engineering and will and the stubborn refusal to accept that survival was insufficient. That what you survived toward mattered as much as the surviving itself. They had arrived at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, and they had done what the Colonial Fleet had always done with worst possible moments, they had worked with what they had. The Battle of Shanxi would be recorded differently in 3 separate historical traditions. Turian accounts would emphasize the tactical adaptation, the first real data on silent combat methodology, the field decisions of de Solis Arterius that the hierarchy would debate in war colleges for generations. Alliance records would mark it as the moment first contact became something more complex than anyone had planned for. Colonial survivors would call it, simply, the day they stopped running. Not because the Cylons were gone, because they weren't, but because for the first time in 4 years there was somewhere to run to, and people willing to stand beside them. The Reapers, in their deep dark patience, observed and recalculated. The error remained unresolved. Hera Agathon grew up on Shanxi, under a real sky, with her hands in real earth, humming a tune that the Aseri matriarchs would one day recognize from texts older than the Protheans. Some cycles end. Some are interrupted. Some are transformed by the arrival of something that was never supposed to be there, something that brings its own wounds and its own wisdom and its own stubborn, irreducible insistence on being alive. The galaxy would remember Shanxi. It would remember Galactica. It would remember that sometimes salvation arrives already broken, and saves you anyway. The galaxy will remember this. More stories await.